Get ready for something super cool. This video is packed with our top 10 dresser makeovers, and trust me, they are all jaw-dropping. From plain and old to wow-worthy, these transformations are full of surprises. Stick around and let's check out these awesome makeovers together.
Hey everyone, Natalie here from A Ray of Sunlight with another fun furniture flip. Okay, I actually had issues with it, but I love how it turned out in the end. So I removed the hardware and had a hard time getting off that fake keyhole cover, so I decided to just leave it, even though I don't care for it. Then I cleaned the dresser to remove the gunk, dirt, and grime from the surface. I didn't want any of those things to interfere with the paint being able to stick to the dresser. And then I sanded everything else as well, just to give the paint a good surface to stick to. And I cleaned off all of the dust. Even though I was using chalk paint, I don't like taking a chance that the paint won't stick, so I sprayed 2 coats of clear shellac all over the dresser and made it all nice and shiny after I had just sanded everything to a dull finish. There is a method to my madness, I promise. The next day, I brushed this deep Moody green called Hollow Hill. I personally like to add some water to my chalk paint to thin it out just a little bit so I don't get so many brush marks in the paint job. After a couple of coats of paint, I tried spraying Varathane's polyurethane in the spray can on it, and it just did not work. That stuff is usually my favorite stuff in the regular container, but this stuff was just really matte and the finish wasn't even at all. And there were brush marks in the paint still, and I was just so done with it. So I put it in timeout for a couple of weeks. And when I came back, I did what I should have done in the first place. I removed the keyhole, sanded all of the brush marks out of all of the paint, and then lightly brushed on more paint. Then I sprayed 3 coats of my favorite top coat on it, which was still Varathane, but with my paint sprayer. And I didn't love the old hardware anymore, so I made new leather poles for the drawers. And here is what it looks like now. I absolutely love it. What do you think? Ooh, this is one of my favorite makeovers, and it only took me a day to do. We bought this MCM dresser from the thrift store for only $30. It was a little bit worn out, but mostly in really good condition still. First, I cleaned it and filled in the few chips and dings with some wood filler. Then I sanded the wood filler down with 220 grit sandpaper. And then I sanded everything else as well, just to give the paint a good surface to stick to. Most of this dresser is wood, but the top was laminate, so I made sure to do an extra good job on that top. Then I cleaned all of the dust off with my shop vac and a tack cloth. I thought it would be nice to leave the drawers wood, so I sanded them down to the bare wood veneer. I had to be careful though, so I didn't sand through the veneer. But I started with 100 grit sandpaper, then moved to 150 grit sandpaper, and then to 220 grit sandpaper. Moving through the different grits of sandpaper helps avoid those nasty swirl marks sanders can leave behind. Look at how pretty that wood is now. It was well worth the 4 hours of sanding. Then I cleaned off all of the dust and sprayed 3 thin coats of Minwax's fast-drying oil-based polyurethane onto them. While those were drying, I set up my little paint booth in my garage and primed the dresser. I like using shellac-based primers the best because they block bleed-through stains and they have excellent adhesion. This one was Bin shellac-based primer. I don't love how much texture the rollers leave behind though, so once the 2 coats of primer were dry, I sanded the primer smooth. Then I put the paint in the paint sprayer and painted the first coat of paint. This paint is General Finishes Enduro Poly in Black. It's a pretty thin paint, so it doesn't need to be thinned out, and it really can only be sprayed. It's way too thin to brush on. It dries fast in about an hour, so it goes pretty fast. I like to lightly sand between coats with 400 grit sandpaper to get the smoothest feeling finish, but it's not really necessary. The next day, I put the drawers back in the dresser, and here is what it looks like now. This makeover was pretty straightforward and was so fast compared to a lot of my other makeovers. I love the natural wood mixed with the black. What do you think? I cannot wait for you to see what I did to this dresser. First, I repaired a broken drawer track with some scrap wood and some glue. and I screwed another loose track back into place. The dresser had a really bad paint job that scratched off decently easily, so I wanted to get rid of that before doing anything to it. I started to sand the top, but it was just going to take me so long to sand down, so I decided to use citrus strip instead. Then I did what I was most excited to do. I added these half-round wood dowels to the bottom curvy drawer. I cut them all to the right size, sanded the edges, and then started in the middle and glued them onto the drawer. The next day, I sanded the bottom edge to make sure that they were all flush with the drawer, and holy moly, I love the new look. Then I got ready to paint everything and primed it with my go-to clear shellac. I used this fusion mineral paint color called Bayberry and a Stahlmeister paintbrush to brush it on. I did add some water to the paint to thin it out and to help prevent the brush strokes from being in my paint job. This fusion mineral paint is an all-in-one paint that has excellent adhesion, and it dries into a very durable matte finish that doesn't necessarily need a top coat, so it's very beginner friendly. And these Stahlmeister paintbrushes work so well with it to create a brush-free finish. I did sand in between the coats of paint with 220 grit sandpaper to smooth out any of the brush marks that I did have. Even though this paint does not need a top coat, I usually top coat with some water-based polyurethane just because I don't like the matte finish and it just can get really scuffed up and dirty really easily. But this time I decided to skip it. I'll be honest though, after all was said and done though, I did put a light coat of Wise Owl's furniture salve on it just to make it so it wouldn't get all that dust marks on it just by touching it. Anyway, to finish off the makeover, I put new hardware on, and this time I offset it so it was on the top center of the drawers instead of the middle center. And I put new knobs on that bottom drawer. That was a bit of a pain, but eventually I got the holes drilled and fixed right up. And here is what it looks like now. What do you think? I don't know about you, but I love the detail on the bottom drawer. I absolutely love this Bayberry color, and I love the offset hardware. We bought this rundown dresser from the thrift store for $40. Right off the bat though, the knobs were a pain to remove. So I ended up busting the knobs so I could get a hold of the metal piece and unscrew the nut. Then I cleaned the dresser. And I removed the loose veneer with a putty knife thing to get under all of it and pry it off. I absolutely love the detail on the drawers, but the veneer was loose and chipping off of them too. But instead of taking all of the veneer off of these, I glued it back on the best that I could. The next day I removed the rest of the veneer from the top with the help of an old iron and a wet towel. I'm not gonna lie though, it still took me over an hour to take off the veneer just from the top. But it was so much easier this way than without the iron and the towel. And then we took the dresser out to the garage and I filled the sides of the dresser with Bondo. On the drawers, I used Quickwood to fill the chips because I can mold the Quickwood to the right shape that I need. I came back a couple of hours later and sanded those down flush with the wood around it, and then I sanded everything else just to make it feel all nice and smooth. And I sanded the top of the dresser smooth, and I even sanded all of the paint off of the edge too. There was so much sanding on this project. Then I cleaned off the dresser and I primed it with 2 coats of clear shellac. And then I was ready to paint. So for this project, I mixed up a custom color with Melange's all-in-one paint line. I mixed up basically a 50-50 ratio of Basilisk Black and Jacob's Well, with probably a little bit more of the black than the green. And I ended up spraying on 3 coats of paint. When the paint was dry, I removed the plastic from the top and wiped 3 coats of some satin water-based polyurethane on to protect it. While that was drying, I tried out a couple of different types of hardware. I tried on some white knobs, some gold knobs, some black knobs. I was torn between the black and the gold ones, but I think I needed a different style of gold knobs. And here's what it looks like now. We went with the black knobs and I absolutely love it. I am so glad that I kept the detail on the drawers, and I absolutely love this custom color. This little dresser was $25 at the thrift store. It was missing some legs, and it was just plain beat up. but I love the simplicity of it, so I could play around with it. First, I used it to create a video on the not so well known reason why it's important to prime before painting wood furniture, especially when painting redwoods like this mahogany. And then I had to take all of that back off for this makeover. While we worked on that, we also cleaned out the dresser and replaced some missing drawer stoppers with new ones. Then I filled in the old hardware holes with my favorite filler, Quickwood. We went to Home Depot and bought a bunch of 1/2 inch and 5/8 inch square dowels. And then I cut the wooden dowels with my miter saw to the same size of the drawers. I clamped some wood down onto the saw to make sure that I cut them all the same length, and I cut them in groups of 3. Before I attached them to the drawers, I removed the stickers and sanded each piece to make sure there weren't any splinters on them. Then I started in the center of the drawer, attaching them with the pin nailer and some Gorilla Glue. I went for a 1 inch gap between each dowel and alternated between the 1/2 inch and the 5/8 inch dowels. The most frustrating part of this whole entire process for me was that the pin nailer kept getting jammed, so I had to keep fixing it. This whole process though took about 3 hours for the 3 drawers, and I enjoyed every single part of it except for the sanding and the pin nailer jamming. The next day I filled in the pin nail holes and sanded the dresser to get it ready for paint. Then I primed the dresser with clear shellac so I wouldn't have any bleed through issues and to help the paint stick to the wood. The next day I painted the dresser with Melange's all-in-one paint in the color Jet Black. I used my Wagner Flexio and added some water to the paint. And guys, it sprayed like a dream. This paint does not need a top coat and it dries to a more satin sheen, so I don't even feel like I need to top coat it. I ended up spraying 2 coats and then I sanded everything with 400 grit sandpaper to smooth it all out, and then I sprayed one last coat. Then I created a new wood base out of 1x2 inch oak board and attached everything together with Craig jig pocket holes and screws. And here is what it looks like now. This one is staying with me for now, and I absolutely love it. I bought this dresser from my neighbor for about $80. These antique dressers are so hard to find in my area, so even though it was in really rough shape, I just could not pass it up. And part of the work was done for me already. So I set a wet towel on the top of the dresser to finish removing the damaged veneer from the top. And while I waited for the water to soak into the veneer, I sanded the rest of the dresser with 100 grit sandpaper. Man, I love when the old finish just sands off so easily like this, and that was definitely the case for this makeover. It's not always the case. I was able to sand most of it with the sander and the foam pads, but the details on the bottom and the crevices on the legs got sanded by hand. Then I sanded everything with 150 grit sandpaper and then 220 grit sandpaper to make everything nice and smooth. After all of that sanding was done, I finished removing the veneer on the top of the dresser by setting my hot iron on the wet towel, letting the heat and moisture soften the glue and make the veneer more pliable. And then I used a putty knife to finish getting the veneer off. If you've ever tried to remove veneer, you know it is not easy, unless it is really loose already. But this is the easiest way that I have found to remove old damaged veneer. And side note, I don't remove veneer that is only chipped in a couple of places, but I do remove veneer that is lifting a lot and damaged in multiple places. Alright, with all of that out of the way, I wiped a coat of water-based poly onto the dresser with this foam sponge. You might be able to notice that the top drawer is a different color than the rest. So I mixed some brown paint and water to kind of stain it, but that didn't really work. So then I mixed some orange paint with some water and wiped that onto the drawer, and voila! Now it matches. And I've got to say, I am pretty impressed with myself for getting it matched that well. And then I whitewashed the entire dresser with some watered down white chalk paint and a lint-free rag. The next day I applied 3 more coats of water-based poly to seal the wood and the whitewash. And then I put on new dark knobs to accent the dark stain that I had left in the details. And here is what it looks like now. What do you think of this new look? Let me know in the comments. We bought this dresser on Facebook Marketplace for $100, and it's getting a makeover. I removed the hardware and cleaned it really well inside and out. Then I scuff sanded the entire dresser, basically just lightly sanding everything to scuff up the finish. But I didn't want to sand through the stain. Basically, I just wanted to sand it enough that the paint will have a better chance at sticking to the dresser. The top of this dresser is laminate, so basically plastic, So I sanded that really well because paint has a harder time sticking to plastic. Then I primed the dresser to help the paint stick and to help prevent stains from coming through the paint. I sprayed 2 coats of clear shellac, letting it dry for an hour between coats. And then I tried something new and it didn't really work, but it is what it is. I kind of tried to do a whitewash on the laminate, but I didn't wipe it off after brushing it on because the paint wouldn't soak into the laminate, but I probably should have at least tried. I didn't even really try that hard. Anyway, I ended up just painting 2 coats of paint on the top, and then I brushed some water-based stain over it to kind of make it look like stained wood. At this point, I wasn't really loving it, but thought that I would move on to the next step. I mixed a few different colors of paint together, Little Whale, French Eggshell, Homestead Blue, and Casement to make this pretty blue. And then I sprayed it onto the dresser. When the first coat of paint was dry, I opened the drawers and brushed the paint on the top and side edges of the drawer fronts. Usually I put plastic on the drawers so I can spray them, but I didn't really feel like it, so I brushed the paint on instead. When the drawers were dry, I pushed them back in and noticed some paint drips, so I sanded out the paint drips with a fine grit foam sponge, cleaned up the dust, and then sprayed on a second coat of paint. Now for probably the most satisfying part, I removed the tape and plastic on the top. Then I top coated everything with my favorite water-based polyurethane. I didn't want to put the original hardware back on, so I put new hardware back on. And here is what it looks like now. I'm still honestly not really sure about the top. I really just wanted to paint everything blue. I'm wondering though, what would you do? Let me know in the comments. Hey everyone, it's Natalie from A Ray of Sunlight with another furniture makeover. First, we removed the hardware, cleaned it all with crud cutter, and filled in the old hardware holes. Then I sanded the top down to bare wood to get rid of all of those scratches. And then I restained it with some wood conditioner and some special walnut stain, I believe it was. I let it dry and then I covered it so then I could work on the rest of the dresser. I sprayed 2 coats of clear shellac on the dresser and let it dry overnight. And then the next day I mixed 2 chalk paint colors from Country Chic Paint. I mixed 1 part pea coat to 3 parts jitterbug to make this really pretty greenish blue. I sprayed on a couple of coats with my favorite but expensive HVLP paint sprayer from Fuji. This sprayer always sprays like a dream, especially compared to the cheap beginner ones. I let the paint dry between coats and then I sprayed 1 coat of clear top coat on it to seal everything. Without the coat of polyurethane between the chalk paint and the next step, which is glaze, the glaze will immediately soak right into the paint and you will not be able to manipulate the glaze or wipe it off at all. So this coat of poly is one of the very most important steps in this whole process. And then the real fun began. The next day, I brushed some of this Valspar antiquing glaze onto the dresser, working in small sections. I wiped most of it back off with some baby wipes. This was basically just to create a base layer with everything, just having a little bit of glaze on it. For some reason, it is so much easier for me to create the full glazed look with 2 coats of glaze instead of just 1. I'm not sure if that's just me and trying to make more work for myself, but hey. Then I let it dry for a day, and then I came back with another coat of glaze. This time I tried to leave some more glaze into the details, crevices, and the corners. I'm not gonna lie, this part is probably the very hardest part for me, trying to get it all to just look right and not taking off too much glaze and not leaving too much glaze. And then you probably guessed it, I let it dry again until the next day. I liked how the glaze looked the next day, so I sealed it all up with 3 coats of water-based polyurethane, and here's what it looks like now. Glazing is definitely not for the faint of heart, or for a really fast project, but man, is that antiqued look not worth it? Let me know in the comments.
This Henry Don high-end dresser needed an update. It had scratches on the finish, and I just wanted a lighter look. First, we removed the old hardware with a screwdriver. I tested a new-to-me product to remove the finish. It's called Stripwell QCS, and it's a simple and safe but effective stripper. I wrapped all of the drawers in plastic to keep the wood stain and stripper from getting all over them. Then I sprayed a coat of stripper all over the dresser. I waited 15 minutes and then sprayed on another coat and waited another 15 minutes. And then I used a plastic scraper to remove the stain. I used 4-0 grit steel wool with some QCS on it to scrub off the stubborn spots and clean it all off. I repeated my process for each section, then I let the dresser dry. The next day, I sanded the dresser with 220 grit sandpaper. Sticking with the safe, low VOC theme of this project, I chose to stain it with water-based wood stain. But I wanted to make sure that I liked the color of the wood stain before I stained all of it. So I tested it on one side, I liked how it looked, so I started the process on the rest of the dresser. I wiped everything down with a tack cloth to remove any of the dust. Then I wiped on some water-based pre-stain to help the wood absorb the stain more evenly. Then I brushed on the wood stain. I used the zebra fan brush and used the special walnut color. After it was on one section, I immediately wiped off the excess with lint-free rags until the stain looked even. I let it dry for 3 hours and then I top coated the stain. I used my favorite water-based polyurethane and a zebra top coat paintbrush. Before the last coat, I felt the surface and it was slightly rough, so I sanded everything with 400 grit sandpaper to make it all feel nice and smooth. Then I applied the last coat of polyurethane, I let it dry overnight, and then I put the hardware back on. And here's what it looks like now. It's so fresh and looks completely new again. And I loved being able to do all of this in my home without stinking it up with oil-based nasty products. What do you think of the new look? Let me know in the comments.
In this video, I'm showing you how I transformed this old, boring dresser into a chic and trendy addition to any home. We took off the hardware, then gave this dresser a good vacuuming inside to get rid of the dirt and the spider webs. Next, we thoroughly cleaned the dresser inside and out with Crud Cutter. We scuffed up the finish of the dresser with 220 grit sandpaper and medium grit foam sanding pads. We then taped off the drawers with pre-taped plastic and painter's tape. We went ahead and primed the dresser with black Aqualock primer using our trusty Wagner Flexio 5000 paint sprayer. We decided to switch things up and try out the eye spray nozzle, the bigger nozzle, instead of the usual detail finish nozzle. We sprayed it on after thinning the primer with about 15% water. We also filled in any scratches or dings with plastic wood filler and then left it to dry overnight. The next day, once the filler had dried up, we gave it a good sanding with some 220 grit sandpaper using a power sander, tidied up the dust with a vacuum hose and brush attachment, and then wiped it down with a tack cloth. We chose the Sherwin-Williams Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel paint in the color Iron Ore for this modern gray dresser. At first, we decided to give the Wagner Eye Spray nozzle another try with actual paint. But when we actually started spraying the paint, I wasn't really loving how the spray was coming out, and I was nervous that there would be a lot of bumps and texture in the dried paint. So we switched back to our usual detail finish nozzle that is more for furniture, and boy, it did give a much finer finish while I was spraying. But with this paint, it levels out so well that when the paint was dry, most people I don't think would notice the difference in those two sections that I sprayed with the two different nozzles. And then when the paint was dry, guess what? I could see on the top where the wood filler had filled in the scratches. The paint had a different sheen right where the wood filler was. So I dabbed on some primer with my paintbrush. I didn't want to actually brush it on because I didn't want brush marks. After the primer dried, we sanded it smooth again with 220 grit sandpaper, and then we painted the final coat on the dresser. Last but not least, we replaced the hardware on this dresser with adjustable pulls that fit a variety of different sizes of hardware holes. So here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looks like now. I am so happy with how it turned out.
Are you confused and not sure where to start with your furniture makeover? Don't worry, I got your back. Click the link in my comment to download our free painting checklist so you can paint your furniture as if you hired a professional to do it.